We're living our truth now. Krista, what?
Krista who?
Christadelphian?
Did you say Christian Dolphin? So are you from Philadelphia?
Welcome to the Life After Leaving podcast, an ex-Christadelphian podcast.
Hello, heathens, and welcome to the podcast. I'm your host, Cinia, with our first history episode. Today we're going to start at the beginning. No, not with Genesis 1:1, but with the origins of the Christadelphians. Don't worry, you won't even need to open your Bibles to follow along. This episode is going to get us started learning about an important figure in Christadelphian history, Dr. John Thomas, and take a critical look at the traditional origin story myth of the Christadelphians. For anyone who is just learning about the Christadelphians for the first time, this will introduce you to some of the basics about how this religion came into being, and will also introduce Dr. Thomas, who will be featured in many future episodes. However, please listen to the welcome episode for some basic information about the Christadelphians and some useful terms that you should know to follow along. For those of you who are members of the Christadelphians and have since left the group, let's see if the historical record matches up with what you were taught. It's time to ask all the questions you never even thought to ask. Like, how many times was John Thomas baptized? What boarding school did he attend? Did he truly develop the Christadelphian teachings on his own? Today we're going to take a look at what information the Christadelphians have preserved over time about their founding and compare it to the mythical origin story we learned. Since the Christadelphians really want people to learn things for themselves, let's see what we can learn today. I wanted to start this episode with a simple introduction by saying that Dr. John Thomas is the founder of the Christadelphians, and to everyone outside of the Christadelphians, he is. A quick Google search will tell you that. However, even this statement that the group's founding should be attributed to Dr. Thomas is debated by some Christadelphians, so let's examine why that might be. First, let me introduce Dr. John Thomas. He was born in 1805 in London, England, underwent training to become a medical doctor, then later emigrated to the United States. He wasn't particularly famous, but he was well known enough during his lifetime that Thomas has a short biography recorded in the 1887 Appleton's Cyclopedia, and it records that John Thomas is a, quote, founder of a sect, unquote. Before you tell me that that's not very specific, let me read you another line from the Cyclopedia. It records that when John Thomas left his previous religious community, he then, quote, founded another whose members he called the Christadelphians, unquote. Okay, but wait. So he was in another group, then founded this group, and he named the group the Christadelphians. So this is telling me he was a religious person who decided to found a religion. I guess that's not too controversial. We're all kind of on the same page that he's their founder. Great. So one early Christadelphian author who was a contemporary to Thomas named Robert Roberts also records the prominence of John Thomas to the founding of the group in his book, Dr. Thomas, His Life and His Work. He wrote that, quote, so far as we can see, but for John Thomas, those who now rejoice in the truth would still have been sitting, like the rest of the world, in darkness and the shadow of death, unquote. And yes, Christadelphians use the term the truth as an interchangeable term for the name of their group and its related doctrines. But if John Thomas is responsible for bringing these teachings to his followers, and other independent historical records at the time corroborate him founding this group, then why would that be controversial? When did it come about? Is there something about this humble background that Christadelphians are trying to rewrite or hide? So let me tell you what many modern Christadelphians believe about the origin of their religion. If you look through a modern Christadelphian book collection or visit Christadelphian websites, you'll see an interesting phrase show up quite a bit. Many Christadelphians claim that John Thomas did not found the group, but that he rediscovered these beliefs. One book is even entitled John Thomas and His Rediscovery of Bible Truth. And sorry, I did not read that book. Many Christadelphian writings recycle this term, rediscovered, like he's the Christopher Columbus of religion. He just got lost on a boat and then ends up with fame and power. Except this time a privileged white man claimed he found an exclusive knowledge of God that he needs to share with the world instead of land inhabited by innocent people. And honestly, that's not far off from how the origin story is told, which I promise I'll tell you in just a moment. But what does it mean to rediscover a religion? If someone rediscovered something, that implies that it originally belonged to someone else. So what are the original roots of the group? could this Christadelphian claim be true? Let's get into it. When I was a Christadelphian, I was not really taught anything about John Thomas other than being a short script about the origins of the Christadelphians to share with people when they asked about my faith. It never really occurred to me to look into the history more when I was a member of a group, because we were always looking towards the future, as in waiting for the end of the world. So we only looked forwards, not backwards. And to get us started, I want to share a paraphrased version of the Christadelphian origin story as I remember being taught it growing up in a Christadelphian household in North America. If you grew up as a Christadelphian, you probably heard a similar story. It begins with the emigration of Dr. John Thomas. Dr. Thomas decided to take a ship from England to America, but during a storm, the ship nearly sank, and the doctor declared that if God saved him, he would study religion. When he landed in America, he made good on his promise to God and read only the Bible to learn about God's message. This is when he rediscovered God's one truth and created a group called the Christadelphians. He believed that he had discovered God's message of hope to the world that had been lost since the days of the apostles. He modeled the sect after the first century churches, and he even called them ecclesias, reviving the ancient Greek word for church. He is just another person and not a prophet, but Thomas wrote several books expounding his exposition and interpretation of the Bible from his personal studies. These are still recommended reading for all Christadelphians, and they're also frequently mentioned during exhortations by the brothers. All right, now we're going to learn some history. Before I start our story of the truth behind Dr. Thomas's life and the origin of the Christadelphians, I just want to share that I'll be quoting extensively from the book John Thomas, His Friends and His Faith by Peter Hemingray, which is the most comprehensive book of early Christadelphian history that I've found, written by a modern-day Christadelphian. I'll also be quoting a lot from John Thomas, His Life and Work by Robert Roberts, who is a Christadelphian contemporary to Dr. Thomas. So when you hear me mention Roberts or Hemingray, I'm referencing these works by Christadelphians. Also, on the back of the book, Hemingray credits Thomas as founding the group, so I just want to share that both of these books, which are the most prominent histories of Christadelphians, credit him as the founder, which is probably telling. I will also be sharing a works cited page listing the references I've made in this episode, as there are a few other websites and resources I used while researching this episode. To get us started, we're going to rewind the story to begin when John Thomas was a boy growing up in England before he ever decided to travel to America, because everyone has a backstory and his is certainly important. He was actually the son of a minister who was known for bouncing around a lot between congregations, towns, and faiths. Due to his father's instability, John Thomas grew up on the move, exposed to religion, but without the stability of a single church during his formative years. I'm not going to go a lot further into his dad, but if that interests you, you can find more detail about him in Hemingway's book. John Thomas was more interested in medicine than religion, despite being raised by a minister. His father also baptized him as an infant in Chorley, England, so that was his first baptism. He did attend church growing up as well. Hemingway wrote that, quote, John Thomas began his medical studies and also became a member of his father's church, unquote, while the family lived in Chorley, England when he was a teenager. However, John Thomas only remained a member of this church for 6 months after his family moved once again when his father changed jobs, so it's likely that he hadn't been that passionate about church or hadn't developed a strong faith at that stage of his life. He would rather be spending time learning about medicine and attending school. Now, there is a reason why I wanted to look at his religious background. I bring this up because in the Christadelphian origin myth, and in his direct quotes, John Thomas is said to be a man with a distinct lack of knowledge of the Bible and religion. That makes this the first place where I notice that the Christadelphian narrative of their founding and the actual recorded Christadelphian history diverge, and he hasn't even boarded the boat to America yet. Roberts quoted Thomas as telling him that, quote, his early years were spent in private boarding schools in England, and not having his mind perverted by human tradition, his mind just takes whatever impressions the word may make upon it, like a blank sheet the impression of the printer's types, unquote. This was an important point that Thomas and Roberts would repeat often, of how blank his mind was surrounding the Bible and religion. I mean, that would be really mean if they were just talking about him in general, so apparently this is just about religion. However, this is already a little suspect, seeing as his dad was a minister. But yeah, it looks like he wasn't attending church consistently, so let's keep the story moving. Thomas elaborated later on why this was important when he wrote a caricature of himself speaking to another character in his early magazine, which was later reproduced in his biography by Roberts. I also want to note that it's obvious that this is a caricature of himself, as he is quoted as saying the exact same lines that are attributed to him earlier in his biography. So when Thomas is explaining how he was different than other religious leaders, he brought up that, quote, "This is the true cause of the difference between them. The teacher of the one is the word of God alone. The teacher of the other is compounded of popular divines in the word. You need not marvel then that they come to such different conclusions." Unquote. It was a classic us versus them framing of the issue, and Thomas wanted his followers to perceive him as having a uniquely special understanding of the Bible that came from a lack of traditional religious training and upbringing, apparently. I think, in other words, he wants to convey that he is less biased in his religious beliefs because he wasn't taught the standard religious teachings like people in the paid clergy of other religious groups. I think I can see the premise of what he wants to say, but honestly, it's sort of a weird argument. I can't imagine telling someone that I've never taken a physics class, but because I read a physics book, I'm uniquely informed to teach students how physics works and also how other physics teachers are wrong, and you shouldn't listen to them because they're too educated. It's kind of a bold argument when you reframe it to be about anything else. But that's the argument he decided to go with to appeal to his audience. I mean, I think we still see this attitude of the subversive leader a lot in the present day. And it doesn't just have to be about religion, but anyone who's claiming to be knowledgeable about something, but who isn't associated with the people who are regarded as experts in that subject or lacking supporting credentials. It brings to mind Dr. Joe Dispenza. The only credential that has been fact-checked is his degree as a chiropractor. And he may be the best chiropractor ever, but he's made claims about doing neuroscience research and having a PhD, despite not holding any credentials as a neuroscientist or providing evidence of having completed a PhD program. So he may be knowledgeable, but is someone who's not a neuroscientist the best resource for neuroscience research? Is someone with no background in religion the best resource for religion? Probably not most of the time. I do think people like thinking that they're special and that they're getting exclusive knowledge that others don't have. So maybe that's why this argument was considered persuasive and why Thomas's lack of credentials was reframed as something of value instead of a hindrance. I mean, if you want to sell people on something, it probably helps to think it's something no one else can offer them. And if they ask you why you don't have qualifications, tell them it's an asset. And also, you shouldn't trust well-educated people. So, Thomas and modern Christadelphians say that even though he had a role in the early founding, he wasn't a prophet. He's just a really good reader. And I guess because he was so intelligent and so blank of mind, with a head full of tumbleweeds as far as religion is concerned, he was able to read the Bible and interpret it more clearly than anybody else alive, ever. Which, okay. But anyways, it apparently took a huge risk of dying to bring about his interest in the Bible and get him to, actually read it. He never pursued any education about the Bible before that. I mean, you would have to work at it to be that blank of mind, right? He never even saw a "put the Christ back in Christmas" bumper sticker. That's how little he knew about Christianity. And I don't know, but we are talking about his education, so this feels like a good time to share that John Thomas's father actually founded a boarding school. Okay, guess what he called it? He called it the, quote, "educational establishment for the sons of dissenting ministers," unquote. An educational establishment for who? For the sons of ministers. His father was a minister. And that leads us to ask, I wonder what kind of person would attend a school for sons of ministers? That seems a little niche. I mean, I would assume the son of the minister who founded the school would have attended, right? Yeah. Conveniently, this fact was not included in his biography that was written by Roberts, but it was included in Hemingway's book, John Thomas, His Friends and His Faith. And that makes it kind of funny, because Hemingway is being a good Christadelphian, writing this book for Christadelphians, not realizing that his book just gives evidence that seems to have caught John Thomas in a lie. Based on the timeline provided by Hemingway, this leads us to think that when Roberts recorded that Dr. Thomas said he was in, quote, private boarding schools, unquote, that prevented him from getting a religious education, there's evidence that about 4 or 5 years were in a boarding school, and it was most likely a religious boarding school run by his father, who was a religious leader. This is actually the only boarding school that Hemingway mentions John Thomas attending. And Hemingway also records him as living with his family until he was about 16, so those time periods overlap. So although we aren't given any other specifics about his early education and living arrangement, the evidence indicates that the only boarding school he attended was his father's school for sons of ministers, and that he did not go away to any other secular boarding schools. So here's the second divergence we found, and he still hasn't even gotten on the boat in our story. So it seems likely that he made up his claim about attending non-religious boarding schools and being away from his father's religious influence entirely, or at a minimum omitted several years of theological education and the heavy influence of religion in his younger years. So we're seeing some holes in his backstory, which is why we had to start back here first. At this point, this kind of feels like a kid who grew up with dentists for parents, and he's saying he's never been to the dentist. Oh, you've never been to the dentist? Because we all know your parents make you get rid of the hard candy and the super sugary treats people give you. They probably make you use mouthwash every night. Like, come on. And if you didn't like it and you wanted the sugary treats, or in this case, you wanted to live oblivious to religion, it's just not happening based on your environment. Just admit it. You don't pick your parents, but you did choose to conveniently omit that you attended your dad's religious school. Also, when we're looking at this origin story, I wanted to point out one other question I have. If he had no religious background, then why did he think the truth was in the Bible? I know. Christians are already mad at me for just saying that. But seriously, just the fact that John Thomas decided to seek out answers to questions of faith in the Bible indicates a bias. If you truly have no theological education, then first, you don't know what a Bible is and what it's about, presumably. Second, he wouldn't know all of the beliefs that he loudly claims are false in many of his writings later on. Third, if he wanted to find the one true religion, wouldn't he sift through all religions first and then eliminate them as he figures it out? This is more of a philosophical argument, but truly, if he had been raised in another society or a different time period, he may look towards the Quran or the Torah or the Bible, the Apocrypha or the Book of Mormon or the Gold Plates of Joseph Smith to find the key to salvation, or even meditation or yoga or CrossFit or whatever. Why did he choose the Bible? He claimed he wanted to find the truth, but philosophically speaking, who says Christianity and the King James Version of the Bible are even correct? Clearly he already had a bias towards believing some form of Christianity was the correct religion. And this would have been rooted in his early life exposure to the Bible and Christianity. And there's a reason I'm bringing this up. After all, in the Christadelphian myth, the idea is that John Thomas read the Bible with an open mind, and that's how Christadelphians came to be, basically. The version Thomas actually says during his life was a little different, though. And again, it's kind of funny because this guy, Robert Roberts, was a huge supporter of Dr. Thomas, and we are going to talk about that in another episode. So in his excitement to rave about how great Thomas was by compiling a biography, he also accidentally shares evidence that conflicts with Dr. Thomas's claims about knowing nothing about religion. He literally wrote the book that uses the quote about him being a blank slate twice and didn't catch the inconsistencies. So let me take a moment to share this example as well, because I think other people reading this biography would probably just gloss over it. In the second chapter of Robert's biography of Dr. Thomas, he records the doctor reflecting on his earlier beliefs. He basically says that he had early beliefs in a soul. So once again, just that alone shows that he at one time had at least some mainstream Christian beliefs and refutes the idea that he was a blank slate regarding religion. I mean, he just admitted to having Christian beliefs. It's like if a criminal's like, I never murdered anyone. And then they're like, except that guy when I was younger. Wait, you just admitted to the opposite of what you just said. What? In the book, Roberts quotes John Thomas as saying that in 1830, when he was 25 years old, he believed, quote, that the mind of man must be immortal because God breathed it into him at his creation, that it was, as the pagans supposed, divine particular aura, a particle of his divine essence, unquote. So in 1830, John Thomas believed in what he later considered a pagan idea, but that there was something small like a particle that was from God that was breathed into humans. This invisible substance was immortal, so it survived death and was not able to be seen, which sounds like the Catholic idea of a soul to me. I also know it can be hard to mentally track dates when talking about history, but 1830 was also only 2 years before he emigrated to America, So he just admitted he did have some religious beliefs that he retained from presumably his childhood or early adulthood, previous to boarding the ship where he claims his religious trajectory began. If you have religious beliefs, you went to a religious boarding school, and your father was a minister who took you to church for 16 years, how exactly are you a blank slate to religion? I just can't think of any reasonable explanation other than he was trying to create a new background for himself that he thought would convince more people to listen to him. And it's almost funny how Christadelphians don't notice this inconsistency in the story, which is why I kind of think that ex-Christadelphians are useful in sharing Christadelphian history more objectively, because I don't have a bias that would encourage me to ignore these inconsistencies. But if you have another suggestion, let me know what's going on, because I just found multiple reasons why this appears to be complete nonsense. I also cannot get over how scientific John Thomas is about his beliefs, and this is a short tangent, but I wanted to fit it in somewhere. This is a continuation of the quote I was just reading above about him having beliefs in an immortal divine particle from God within us. Roberts records Thomas as saying, quote, "It must then depart from the mouth or nostrils. Why not then catch it in some appropriate apparatus, detain it in a bottle, and subject it to chemical analysis?" Unquote. Okay, first, I want to say that no one is allowed to try to capture my soul in a bottle. If I'm in a hospital bed dying, you cannot steal my soul so that you can experiment on it. This is why we have ethics committees for research. Can you imagine the horror of your conscious mind and essence being trapped in a bottle so a religious man can torture you in the afterlife for science? Hell no. I can't stop thinking about it, though, and it's pretty wild. I don't think Christadelphians ever talk about John Thomas wanting to do that. Like, John Thomas literally wanted to bottle your soul if given a chance. And after learning that he lies about his religious background and upbringing, would you trust this man with your soul? Okay. I have one last example before we continue on to discuss another element of the Christadelphian origin myth and whether he rediscovered Bible truth. When I was working on this episode, I actually came across one quote from Peter Hemingray, the Christadelphian biographer, who just rats Dr. Thomas out when he writes that, quote, "We conclude that although Dr. Thomas was not a religious person, he had a good religious education, especially by modern American standards," unquote. Hemingray also found a letter from 1832, which is, quote, "interesting for the clues given as to the religious background he had before arriving in the USA," unquote. That leads Hemingray to write, quote, "He was more than ordinarily grounded in at least some aspects of religious knowledge," unquote. So, hold your emails, because it looks like at least one Christadelphian spotted the inconsistency I did. So I guess everyone else is just choosing to ignore it at this point. Honestly, I really think John Thomas was counting on people not being able to fact check him on his lack of religion in childhood. I mean, I've already found other historical figures who flat out lied about things when I've done historical research, and nowadays it only takes a few minutes to fact check their claims using the internet, ancestry resources, historical documents that have been preserved. But back in the 1800s, who was going to ask him to prove what schools he went to as a child and try to reach out to England from America to verify it? No one. So they could say what they wanted people to believe. It would be recorded in books. And then someone like me would come along 200 years later to fact check it and tell people that they lied about it. So let's move on with the origin story. Since young John Thomas was not inclined towards religion like his father, he set out on his own path and he began studying medicine when he was about 16 years old. Roberts writes that from age 17 to 25, Thomas spent his time, quote, "among the psychic bottles, lecture rooms, and dead bodies," unquote. Thomas graduated from a just 2-year medical program at St. Thomas's Hospital in 1828 and then began his practice as a doctor. This feels like an incredibly short education for someone who at age 23 was now legally able to perform surgeries on people, and this was before the invention of anesthesia. Hemingray points this out a little bit when he wrote in his book that, quote, "there were no licensing boards, no registration, no formal requirements. To practice as a doctor, all that was required was to hang out your shingle and wait for patients," unquote. So the medical field was just a wild, unregulated place when he entered the profession. However, he did technically get schooling in a medical program at a hospital. Okay. And that's the origin of why he's called Dr. John Thomas, or simply the doctor. He was actually a doctor. Okay, so some things are starting to line up. Awesome. Now, His father was still restless in religion and location, so the story goes that Dr. Thomas's father decides that he wants to move to America. Hemingway writes that John Thomas's father decided to send Dr. Thomas ahead of him and his family, but in Roberts recounting the situation where he records what Dr. Thomas told him, Roberts wrote that John Thomas insisted to his father that he go ahead of his family. Here's the full quote from Roberts. Quote, "The doctor, having no special prospects, and intensely disliking a priest-ridden state of society, such as that which prevailed in England to a greater extent than now, did not disrelish the idea of emigrating, but knowing his father's impetuous disposition, he was afraid that he would act rashly in the matter, and therefore proposed that, as a prudent preliminary, he should go to America before the rest of the family and spy on the land and report." Unquote. This again feels weirdly biblical about like spying out the land, and maybe that was on purpose. And it makes sense considering the author was a Christadelphian. But anyway, I thought this quote was interesting because it actually includes religion as part of his push to leave England because he had strong sentiments against the dominant religion of the day. So I do wonder if he wanted to make himself look good, but accidentally proved once again that he wasn't a blank slate. I don't know. This is also the first example of John Thomas kind of presuming to know more than everyone else. He may have been absolutely correct in his assessment that his dad was impulsive and perhaps reckless, to use today's terms, but I do think we can start to paint a picture of the doctor by sharing his interpretation of different events in his life as recounted by Roberts, since Roberts claims that his biography has recorded direct quotes from Thomas himself. So either John Thomas hated priests and his dad was a mess who couldn't be trusted with finding a place to live, or his dad just told his son to leave the country for him and risk his life on a long sea voyage was just, a small favor to him. Either could be true, and both are ridiculous. This brings us to the exciting part of the story, a dramatic sea voyage nearly ending in disaster. In May 1832, when he was now 27 years old, John Thomas boarded the Marquis de Wellesley for America. According to Hemingway, he was one of only 4 people in the cabin class, which is a more privileged and expensive way to travel compared to the steerage passengers. This was evidently because he agreed to be the ship's doctor and also their chaplain, which is interesting, again, since he's so insistent that he knew nothing of religion before coming to America. How would someone with no religious qualifications or, any background with a religious role be able to do that for several weeks in a ship? Maybe not a blank slate. Let's talk about the sea voyage. I'm going to use John Thomas's version of events from the 3rd chapter of Dr. Thomas, His Life and Work by Robert Roberts. All right. So apparently it was terrible weather when they set out. The main mast snapped off, and anything that wasn't strapped down was washed off the deck. It was unrelenting bad weather, and the wind was sweeping them off course for 2 weeks. The people below deck were rightfully terrified while aboard the ship that was being tossed in the waves all day and night. I actually Googled steerage class, and besides being dark and cramped, it was also apparently just close to the waterline, so when the weather was bad, they couldn't have any ventilation since the windows had to be kept closed. They were also just basically trapped in a floating coffin with 70 others in a storm. So, not surprisingly, they begged for a religious service to be held every Sunday to comfort them, because they were afraid of dying, probably feeling seasick, and also probably hadn't even seen the sun in a long time. So for these services, another cabin passenger read the prayers, and then the doctor would read aloud from the Bible. The doctor also apparently read a sermon from the published sermons of a Scottish Presbyterian minister named Thomas Chalmers. There was also no explanation provided about where the book of sermons came from, but the name was provided, and I'm just presuming that it was Dr. Thomas's personal copy. That is speculative. I just can't confirm the book's owner. It's also interesting that the people he was commissioned to serve were driven by their fear of death to want to worship God and have services. Meanwhile, Dr. Thomas, who agreed to be the chaplain before the voyage, and is on the same disastrous voyage as these people, is seemingly unmoved. I say this since Roberts wrote simply that, quote, "It fell to the doctor's part to read a chapter from the Bible," unquote, as though he was just bored or coerced into it. It was just his turn to read the Bible. But he was also in cabin class, so he was included in swanky dinners with the captain and had one of the best rooms on the boat, probably had windows and, could see the sky and sleep, so maybe that's why he wasn't so afraid. All right, so then comes the night that supposedly changed Dr. Thomas's life forever. The beginning of the end was when Dr. Thomas was eating dinner with the captain, so I picture them with like their lobster bibs on, and they disagreed on the location of the ship. The captain apparently thought they were near Sable Island, while Dr. Thomas thought they should, quote, assume the other ships were right and they were wrong and to take soundings, unquote. But according to Robert's version, Thomas said his suggestion was ignored. After dinner, the doctor apparently noticed that the water looked, quote, shallow, unquote, and feared they would run ashore. So he told the second mate about it and was ignored. He then is staring out his fancy cabin class window and voiced his concerns a third time and was apparently told he was just a landsman, apparently, which also seems fair as there's no indication that he had ever been aboard a boat before, and he had never lived in a coastal town when reviewing the places Hemingway recorded as living in and looking at a map. But I don't know, I've never been to England, so who knows? Maybe his definitely not religious boarding school had sailing classes. Again, I can't prove anything here. I just find it interesting when he recalls these stories and no one else is available to share their versions of events. It's just, he always happens to be the smartest guy in the room. Like, the captain didn't notice anything strange and none of the other crew. Like, sure, Dr. Thomas probably was very smart. But maybe he's just an ordinary white man with privilege in the 1800s. I don't know. But I just wonder a little bit if he had some narcissistic tendencies, since once you listen to his stories, he's always kind of framing himself to be so knowledgeable and smarter than everyone else. It's like he was like, oh, I could have saved the ship, but if I was the captain, too bad he didn't listen to me. Like, okay, you're a random doctor. He's literally a sea captain. All right. Apparently, right after he returned to his cabin, after voicing his concerns for the third time in some sort of weird parable sort of situation again, the bottom of the ship scraped land, and the waves lifted the ship and threw it back down 12 times. This again feels more like something out of the Bible, because we grew up learning the symbolism of numbers in the Bible, and 12 means something important. But we'll just keep the story moving. At this time, Roberts writes that, quote, he felt the prospect was pretty certain that they should be broken up and submerged in the waves. His own mind was powerfully acted on by the situation, and in fact, received a bent which determined the track of his future career. Naturally hopeful, he could not persuade himself that he had come to the end of his existence, but the chances of escape were so slim that he felt uncomfortably pressed by the question as to what would become of him in the event of his being drowned. He had never given any earnest thought to the subject of religion. He was far from being irreverent or irreligious, but he had never made religion a matter of practical interest. The consequence was that at such a trying moment as the one described, he felt a cloud of uncertainty. He concluded that the best thing to do in the circumstances would be, as the waves were closing over him, to go down with the prayer upon his lips, Lord, have mercy upon me for Christ's sake. At the same time, he determined within himself that if he ever got on terra firma again, he should never rest till he found out the truth of the matter, for he might no more be found in an uncertain state of mind. Unquote. All right. So this is the big event that changed the trajectory of the doctor's life that we all learned about by growing up Christadelphians to some degree, and usually that's where the story begins. Yes, he was truly on the ship, according to passenger records, and it was a longer and more dangerous voyage than it should have been. Hemingway proposed that it may have been a late season nor'easter, which would have had winds of up to 70 miles an hour. In another tangent, Hemingway was also able to discover that the man who read the prayers for the religious services on the ship was traveling under a fake name with a woman he was pretending was his wife after he stole some money. So this man was arrested when they landed because the storm delayed them so much that the authorities in England were able to hop on a different ship, beat this guy to America, and arrest him. So in the spirit of Scooby-Doo, he would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for that dastardly storm. So it was a religious awakening for one passenger in the storm actually led to a prison sentence for another. Fun fact. Okay, back to our story. After this incident, the Christadelphian origin story says that Dr. Thomas dedicated himself to reading the Bible to discover the truth for himself. I personally always pictured him holed up in an apartment, reading the Bible, hungry for answers, curtains drawn, drinking tea because he's English, and just ignoring the world outside. This sort of talk is recorded in these books talking about his history too. Roberts actually records him as saying, quote, he has addicted himself to the incessant study of the scriptures, unquote. This becomes important because the Christadelphians will tell anyone who will listen that they only believe the Bible. Only the Bible is divinely inspired. The Bible is their only authoritative source. They want you to know that the foundation of the Christadelphians is the Bible. So when Christadelphians talk about John Thomas, and even when he talks about himself, as I brought up earlier, there's an insistence that he was completely independent, original, Bible-based. Roberts also wrote that, quote, he did not rehash what he found in books. He read and thought for himself, unquote. Later, when an argument comes up about the subject of materialism, Roberts records that John Thomas said, quote, I affirm that I have never read a single page of a book except the Bible on the subject called materialism, unquote. Mr. Hemingway also writes in his books that, quote, it is my firm conviction that Dr. Thomas was unusual among his contemporaries in truly trying to discover for himself what the Bible teaches, unquote. Wow. So Dr. Thomas really did just read the Bible to learn about it afterwards? But wouldn't that be discovering and not rediscovering the Bible's truths? Like, what's going on here? Okay, so there's actually more to that second quote. Hemingway wrote that, quote, although John Thomas was a Campbellite by association, he was not bound by their doctrines, but sought out the truth from scriptures and proclaimed it fearlessly, unquote. Dr. Thomas was a what? A Campbellite? So let's rewind and see what actually happened after he got off that boat in 1832. And his colleague who helped him run the religious services, was arrested. Because Christadelphians are credited with being founded in 1848, which would be 16 years after he arrived in America. I mean, not to brag, but I have read the entire Bible in a year. So even if we're going to entertain the notion that the religion developed solely from Dr. Thomas reading the Bible, then did he just read the Bible 16 times and by the end he had just learned everything about it? Like, what was he actually doing to study, preach, and develop the theology that would become the Christadelphian religion around this time? And how on earth do the Campbellites play a part in this? Let's see what Peter Hemingway has to say. Hemingway wrote that, quote, the resultant controversy caused Dr. Thomas to study the Bible, among other writings, to substantiate and firm up his beliefs, unquote. Other writings? So it wasn't just the Bible like we were told after all. Yeah, despite the insistence that Christadelphians only read the Bible, it turns out that John Thomas himself was actively seeking out reading and was being influenced by other religious leaders, books, and ideas of his time. It seems that the doctor was actually a bit of a researcher, eagerly reading, writing, and talking with other people about religion. Hemingway also wrote that, quote, he was quick to quote and use articles from those with whom he agreed, unquote. If you do decide to read his magazine, which was renamed several times, but was typically called the Herald for short, you'll see that he does republish others' works, and since he was the editor, that tells us that he read and selected those works for publication. So Dr. Thomas was not only studying the Bible after his voyage to America, he was reading tons of religious books and magazines. I was a little disappointed to see that, since I'm pretty sure that I at some point in my life told people that Christadelphians developed from a simple, thorough reading of the Bible, and I guess I was wrong. But no one exists in a vacuum, so that's where it's helpful to look at history, put things into context, and get the story straight going forward. What came as a big surprise to me, which many ex-Christadelphians have already learned, was that John Thomas almost immediately joined a religious group called the Campbellites once he arrived in the United States. The scary part is, while reading about Dr. Thomas's time spent with the Campbellites, it gave me a bit of deja vu. Like, many Christadelphian doctrines, phrases, and other attributes can actually be traced back in John Thomas's writing to the Campbellites as an early influence. It was when Thomas joined the Campbellites that he became part of a group that called each other brother and sister. And in chapter 5 of Thomas's biography, Roberts records, quote, Brother Thomas, I shall call upon you for a word of exhortation, unquote, in a Campbellite meeting. I almost lost it reading the exact same phrasing that is used by Christadelphians almost 200 years later, like in the present day. All right, so when I was researching this, and fair warning, this is another tangent, I had the thought that what's interesting here is that he kind of fits the profile of somebody who a cult would target as like the perfect candidate to join them. And hear me out. Research has found that groups with cult-like characteristics target people who are isolated, who are seeking community like college students, also optimistic individuals who can withstand challenges, and those with high earning potential. Also, a cult can cause isolation, especially among the new member's family. So with those in mind, picture John Thomas is a young doctor who's just arrived in a country without his family. He's all alone. And he was optimistic because he just survived this shipwreck and he's motivated to put in some work towards his faith. And he also has a career as a doctor. Like, he fit the bill perfectly for what they might be looking for. So after he joined the group, which was kind of named after one of the most prominent leaders, Alexander Campbell, they quickly convinced and or tricked him into getting baptized, then announced he was a member and asked him to speak to their members about the Bible. According to Hemingway, Thomas's father was upset that John Thomas joined the Campbellites, and they actually became estranged too. So, saw some patterns there. I never really thought about Dr. Thomas as an impressionable young man alone in a foreign country, but it just seems odd to me that he wanted to find the answers for what he believed, and then just immediately joins a religious group. It seems like the opposite of finding the truth for oneself, to join an established group with their own sets of ideas already laid out. And again, I'm not saying it was a cult or that he was a cult member, but I don't think anyone's ever actually looked at the timeline here and noticed some red flags. Someone just should have checked in on him. If my friend moved to another country, immediately joined a religion, became a preacher after just a few weeks, after also apparently never having any religious training, I would be concerned at such a drastic change and the pressure that was also put on them so quickly to show devotion and start working for the group. It's just a red flag and no one's talking about it. Okay, so I'm going to run you through the timeline so you can see what I mean about it being incredibly fast. John Thomas arrived in America, July of 1832. Immediately goes west to Cincinnati, Ohio. He claims he's going to set up his medical practice. Great. However, instead of opening his practice, he was baptized into the Campbellites by September 1832. He spent less than 3 months searching on his own for the truth before joining a religious group. This podcast took me more than 3 months of research and editing to prepare for you today, by the way. That's not enough time to do a complete reading of the Bible and develop a religion. So Hemingway adds a very strange comment in his book when he records Thomas's second baptism, where he was baptized as a Campbellite. And I say second, again, since Ancestry.com records his first baptism as a young child or infant. Hemingway says he was baptized by Mr. Walter Scott. Then in the next sentence, he says, quote, Dr. Thomas here shows very early his independence from any organized religion, unquote. Oh, does he? Him joining a religious group shows that he was independent. I think him refusing to join a group would show his independence. Isn't independence being separate, being on one's own? Do people show their independence by getting married to another person? Do countries show their independence by going under the rule of another country? If I joined a political group and attended their events every week, does that show that I'm independent of the political organization? Is there some definition of independence that I don't know? Coming together, joining a community, becoming a member of the group is the opposite of independence. Dictionary.com says independence is, quote, freedom from the control, influence, support, aid, or the like of others, unquote. I would argue that joining a religious group is going to influence you. It does not make you free from influence. Hemingway was pretty grounded in his analysis overall up to this point. Oh, but I lost it with this. Logically, Hemingway's comment here doesn't make sense. But it does push the narrative of Christadelphians in this origin story myth that he figured it out on his own. Often Hemingway will very subtly mention when he's found something that doesn't quite add up with the dominant narrative. And I've already mentioned some examples in this episode. But in this example, I think that Hemingway is willing to ignore the evidence and is adding in commentary that is not true because consciously or unconsciously, he recognized it as a threat to their beliefs and had to de-escalate people thinking about that fact a little too much. Because I have a feeling that a Christadelphian just reading Hemingway's book would read that sentence and be like, oh, okay, I'm just going to keep reading, because the comment confirms their bias. If he didn't include it, it would end on this note that leaves the reader uncertain of what to believe. And when it says he joined the group, he just very conveniently puts in the sentence to remind you, like, oh, yeah, you should believe that he was an independent thinker, like, regardless of the facts. So Hemingway did some amazing research for his book, thank you. But his analysis is a bit questionable. So continuing our story, it gets worse. Because after John Thomas's dad got mad that his son wouldn't follow whatever religion he was preaching now, Dr. Thomas moves in with a Campbellite named Daniel Gano for 7 months. Hemingway writes that, quote, It is a safe assumption he spent time studying the Bible and the Campbellite writings of the time, unquote. So again, even this Christadelphian historian contradicting himself and admitting that John Thomas was not in a bubble only reading the Bible. He was also living with a Campbellite brother. And again, even if they were dating and he moved in with him after 3 months, I might be a little concerned that they were rushing things. Like, you just moved to a country, you joined a religion, you moved in with a stranger, you stopped talking to your dad. Like, someone should check on him. Like, this was definitely not what I expected. But, maybe we should give him a pass. He's an immigrant. He's just figuring things out. Maybe it's just a phase. Like, he'll start his independent Bible studies soon. Like, once he gets his medical practice set up, he's got to make the rent, whatever. So, spring of 1883. This is the year following his arrival in America. He declares Cincinnati has too many doctors. All right, so he leaves town claiming he'll find more work elsewhere. So where does he go? He goes straight to meet one of the leaders of the Campbellites, of course. He heads to Virginia to meet Alexander Campbell himself. Right off the bat, it seems like his motivations were not because of his career in medicine, but instead on his new focus on religion. And he's literally only associating with Campbellites. And they had connections there they hoped would help him. Either way, the Campbellite religion is clearly a big part of his life at this time. And instead of being independent, it seems like he's already codependent. I also had no idea who Alexander Campbell was, so I Googled a little bit of Campbellite history. Apparently, Alexander also became religious after his shipwreck, but his was off the coast of Scotland in 1808. Campbell had been a Presbyterian and a Baptist, and he became involved in the Reformation movement afterwards. So presumably they headed off, talking about shipwrecks. Oh, and this is a great point to take a break for a word from our sponsors. Have you recently been in a shipwreck or near-fatal transatlantic voyage? Did you call out to your God for salvation despite being a heathen? Are you seeking a way to monetize your fear of death? We have a solution for you. Try founding a religion. It's simple and easy with our Shipwreck Savior's proven method. With our simple step-by-step process, you'll have followers lining out the door of your community center for miles. We found the simplest solution for guaranteed success, and we'll work with you every step of the way while you, independently, wink wink, found your new religion. This is an exclusive offer for you, so act now. Are you ready to transform your fear of death into cold, hard cash? Then call us today at 555-5666. Wait, is that splashing I hear? Looks like your followers in the splash zone are gonna get wet at the rate you'll be baptizing your new followers. Call us today at Shipwreck Saviors LLC to get started. That's 555-5666. Terms and conditions may apply. Results may vary. Side effects may include death, threats of legal action pursued by armed mobs, writing books titled with Greek words for some reason, the bottling of your soul for researching, traumatizing children for decades, causing marriages between close cousins, and being cast in the lake of fire at the judgment seat. Don't delay. Call now. Thank you to our sponsors, Shipwreck Saviors. Okay, so back to our story about Dr. Thomas in America. He moved to Virginia because, supposedly, that's a better place to open his medical practice. Sure. However, that's still not what happens. Once he arrives, Dr. Thomas starts preaching there, and this is still only about 8 months after he joined the Campbellites. Okay. And he doesn't stay there long. After hanging out with the Campbellites in Virginia, he decides to travel to Philadelphia in 1833. And in 1834, he started publishing a religious magazine called the Apostolic Advocate, which, quote, rapidly enhanced his already growing reputation as one of the principal presenters of the Campbellite message, unquote. So within 1 year of joining the group, he's one of their favorite speakers. And it's still unclear how much time he's actually putting into, opening his medical practice. And any pretense of returning to England now that he's spied on the land also seems to be gone now that he's finally putting down some roots and has commitments. But now his commitments are writing in support of his religious organization that he joined, which appears to be influencing his decisions about where to go and what to do in America. After seeing this religious fervor in his actions, I'm inclined he went to America because he hated priests in England like Roberts recorded, and not to protect his silly dad from moving to a country willy-nilly. That same year, when he was living in Philadelphia in 1834, was also the year he married a Campbellite. And again, if I was his parent, I'd be wondering if he talks to anyone who isn't associated with this new church. Her name is Eleanor Hunt. She was also known as Ellen, and basically that's all anyone ever bothered to record about her. Growing up as a Christadelphian, I never even knew he was married, since there were no framed portraits of them together. Just him. We had a picture of John Thomas in the ecclesial hall. I also never found a good story about Eleanor's past, or the backstory of how their marriage came to be. I was surprised since Roberts recounted the stories John Thomas shared, and I wonder if he just never spoke about her, or why did he choose her as his wife? Hemingway appears to have done research trying to verify the exact date of their marriage, at least, so there's a little information on when they got married, but there's really very little information about the relationship. It appears she grew up in New Jersey and that they were married in January in Trenton, which is in the center of New Jersey. I just find it sad that no one recorded any mention of love or kindness or companionship between them. I will come back to his family in a later episode. Right now, our focus is really just on John Thomas and the origin of the Christadelphians. However, their relationship may have played a role in his next move because he got really lucky when her parents died the year they got married. Hemingway records that they inherited a farm and $1,000 from her parents, which, according to an online calculator, $1,000 in 1834 is worth $36,519 in 2024. So regardless of why they got married, if it was due to her religious affiliation or something else, by 1834, John Thomas now had religious followers reading his magazine and attending his lectures. He had female property because a woman was simply a man's property in the 1800s. And he got land and money for free because he was legally entitled to his wife's property and financial assets. So America was treating him pretty good. Dr. Thomas, at this point, has now been in America for about a year and a half, and he appears to be really deeply associated with the Campbellites, having been baptized to join as a brother, living with Campbellites, marrying a Campbellite, publishing a magazine for Campbellites. However, if he had no knowledge of the Bible, how did he become so successful so quickly as a religious writer and speaker? Does this talent he had to draw on readers and listeners indicate he was skilled in reading and crafting expositions of the Bible? Well, Dr. Thomas tells us about the first time he was asked to address the Campbellites. He was struggling with what he should discuss for his talk. Robert Roberts writes that, quote, "The doctor took up his Bible and began to turn it over in search of something as a foundation for remark. He went from one end to the other without being able to fix upon anything, when at last it occurred to him that he knew Rollin's interpretation of Daniel's 4 empires," unquote. So this would probably surprise people to hear that the source of his first lecture wasn't actually the Bible. It wasn't his own interpretation of it. I guess he had writer's block, so he borrowed some inspiration. I believe this is a reference to the written work of Charles Rollins, who was an 18th century author and historian, as that's the only corresponding book by this author from that time period on this general subject. But I mean, I'm glad he didn't pretend to get inspiration for his talk from the Bible. He was honest that he sourced his idea from someone who was not affiliated with him. This was his first talk, or as Christadelphians would call it, an exhortation. And nowadays, this isn't uncommon for a Christadelphian to mention that they used another book to help them craft an exhortation. But it does kind of bust a hole in the myths surrounding this man. Does this mean that in his reading of other books that he discovered Christadelphian theology? The only problem with that is I was always told that he discovered Christadelphian teachings from reading the Bible. If anyone reads the Bible, they'll find the same conclusions. So why is he reading these other books? Christadelphians aren't encouraged to read other religious writings. The book Christadelphian Standards, which explains the proper lifestyle and habits of a good Christadelphian, even includes the warning that some Christadelphian books can be considered dangerous. So I want to touch on this other part of the origin myth of the Christadelphians, the claim that Dr. Thomas not only discovered or rediscovered the truth of the Bible, but that he did so by only reading the Bible for himself. Hemingway writes that, quote, "It is my firm conviction that Dr. Thomas was unusual among his contemporaries in trying to discover for himself what the Bible teaches," and he emphasized for himself, unquote. And Hemingway also writes that Dr. Thomas, quote, "sought out the truth from the scriptures," unquote. All right. We already saw Dr. Thomas was hanging out with the Campbellites, which lasted for over a decade, by the way. So he wasn't really learning by himself when he's in this large community, hearing lectures, the exhortations, and engaging with Campbellites. So maybe Hemingway means that Thomas was pursuing independent Bible study in addition to being a part of that community and that figuring out his own ideas by only reading the Bible, since Hemingway says he was using the scriptures, not other religious books. So I don't have time to make a case for if he was unusual among his contemporaries, whatever, but we can look at, was he discovering the truth from the scriptures? I mean, I just read his own explanation of how he used someone else's ideas about religion as a basis for his very first lecture, but let's give him a free pass because he's new to preaching religion. Maybe that was a one-off situation. He was young, desperate for an idea. Or was he reading and utilizing books other than the Bible to develop his beliefs and teachings? If he was, that would indicate that the Christadelphian stance that his beliefs were taken straight from the Bible isn't true. So let's take a look. I'm also not going to go into originality of ideas in this episode, but we're going to look at his writings to see if there's evidence that he was only reading the Bible or if there's evidence that he was reading a broad spectrum of religious works. And again, this may surprise you, but if we look at the evidence, we can see that his writings indicate that he was well read in the religions of the time. This interest and familiarity with religious works was not unique or limited to the early days of his exploration of religion either. What's ironic is that this is not even a critical take, as Hemingway, who I just quoted, wrote in his book that, quote, "There were in fact a large number of Bible expositors presenting interpretations of Daniel and Revelation, similar in outline, although not in detail, to the one Dr. Thomas developed over the next 30 years. Dr. Thomas, as his introduction to Eureka Volume 3 shows, read many of them. Some authors he cites are exceedingly obscure." Unquote. Look at that. So Hemingway points out that John Thomas did not develop his beliefs from scratch, and his ideas actually overlapped with other theologians at that time period and earlier. But more than that, Dr. Thomas was actively reading and utilizing publications, even evidently seeking out obscure publications in his works, indicating that he was researching non-biblical sources to utilize as a foundation for his ideas. His books show that he hadn't stumbled across his ideas by solely reading the Bible or even serendipitously finding corroborating ideas in popular books, but through research and drawing upon other religions' writings dating back centuries. This book, the third volume of Eureka, was written in 1861. So this is almost 30 years after he traveled to America, which is when he says was when he, started this religious journey. So this actually wasn't limited to early in his career either, as we can see here. By this time, the Christadelphians were a group, and he had written several books. And if you actually read the preface of the third volume of Eureka, which is currently available to read online, it's basically name-dropping centuries of people who wrote exposition on Revelation, which he presumably read, as Hemingway points out. So it appears that John Thomas spent decades reading religious writings and referencing them, which is the opposite of what Christadelphians historically claimed. Maybe he decided a theological education was better than being blank of mind, blank slate after all. And I do have another few examples to share. Another example I found was in the Christadelphian book called My Days and My Ways, written by Robert Roberts. In the book, Roberts records a letter he received from Dr. Thomas, and this was decades after Dr. Thomas gave his first talk on the Bible. Dr. Thomas wrote, quote, "Will you please inform Mr. Robinson and request him, if he have funds enough of mine on hand, to send me through Wiley of New York and his agents in Trafalgar Square, Charing Cross, a volume entitled Vigilantius in His Times by Dr. Gilly. I suppose it may be obtained by Seeley & Co., Fleet Street, London. Said Vigilantius flourished in the 4th century, and occupied very much the position to his contemporaries that I do to mine, and was about as popular. I wish, therefore, to form his acquaintance. It will doubtless be refreshing." Unquote. I'll admit, there's nothing wrong with wanting to read a book. But again, Dr. Thomas explicitly states that he would like to read this book about religion in the 4th century. Amazon describes this book as, quote, "essential reading for those seeking to understand early church history." Unquote. So am I crazy, or is this book just not the Bible? These authors didn't even edit their books to hide the fact that John Thomas was reading all of these non-Christadelphian, non-Bible books. I don't care. I love reading books. But if you're going to claim that John Thomas only read the Bible, then how do you explain all these books he was reading on religion? All I'm pointing out is that he was exposing himself to a lot of different religious ideas and actively seeking out religious works, and presumably drawing inspiration from them because he was interested in religion. Anyways, I have one last example which shows another reason why John Thomas was so well read, besides just to relate to 4th century philosophers and to use ideas for his books and exhortations. This example comes from Robert Roberts, who recorded this in Thomas's biography. Roberts wrote that, quote, "The doctor supplied himself with a copy of the Book of Mormon, by means of which he acquired a knowledge of the system to be attacked. Thus armed, he went into the debate on behalf of the truth against the blasphemous and ignorant assumptions of Mormonism," unquote. So this is the other reason why he was reading religious books. John Thomas hated most established religions, and he was convinced his views on religion were correct, while everyone else was obviously wrong. So we already know he was reading books written by people who weren't Campbellites like him to find people he related to and agreed with, but he also went out of his way to read religious books that he knew he didn't agree with. It could be a whole episode just to read the lengthy, repeated attacks he wrote in his books and articles, and who knows if I ever will, about how other religions are wrong and how they basically suck, to paraphrase his rants. Being called only blasphemous and ignorant is about as concise and polite as he ever got. He wasn't satisfied to just develop his own beliefs. He wanted to prove other people's beliefs were wrong, and he frequently debated people such as the Mormon mentioned here. I imagine he read a lot of literature on contemporary religions just so he would feel justified and informed in talking smack about them. If he couldn't use their ideas to bolster his own, as we saw, then he wasn't interested. The quotes from Hemingway's book are also good examples of the mental gymnastics some Christadelphians go through. At one moment, Hemingway was able to confidently assert that Thomas was unique and seeking out the truth from the scriptures. And at the same time, he pointed out that Thomas was extensively utilizing other works from other religions from his books. We can see the examples that I just presented, that he was incredibly well-read on religious books. He was seeking out old and obscure writings. It's just interesting how even though Hemingway presented information that contradicts his own beliefs, he and other Christadelphians continue to believe what they were taught about the Christadelphian origin story myth. Somehow we're supposed to believe that the person who attended a religious school had no religious background. The person who joined a religion and was passionate about it was somehow independent of that group. And the person who was extensively researching religious writings was supposedly only using the Bible to develop his beliefs. These things just aren't matching up. It also makes me notice how different Christadelphians today are from the very first Christadelphian, Dr. John Thomas. Are Christadelphians today reading religious works from other religions that aren't affiliated with the Christadelphians, just like John Thomas did? I haven't seen that. And in my experience, and even in the Christadelphian Standards book, it's discouraged to veer too far off the path that they set out for Christadelphians to follow in their reading. But is there a reason that Christadelphians are pushing this myth? Why aren't they encouraged to be like Dr. Thomas and read widely? What could Christadelphians possibly gain from encouraging their members to not read other books? Is this about the Bible being the source of their religious beliefs? Or is it about control and not finding out something that they don't want you to know? After all, John Thomas read other religious books, and he came to the beliefs that they hold. So wouldn't that be the case for their members? If he learned his beliefs from reading these books, shouldn't you come to the same beliefs if you read them? Seems like it would make sense. And that's why this myth is so important. The most likely reason that they want people to believe John Thomas was the man this myth says he was, in spite of the evidence that who they say John Thomas was isn't true, is probably to control people. It seems like there may be a fear that if people read other books, they'll discover that the Christadelphians might be wrong about their teachings and beliefs. If they can convince people to never look into it and constantly reassure them that what they believe is true, eventually I guess they'll apparently just refuse to believe the facts when they see them, which we've already seen a few times in this episode by looking at Peter Hemingway's writings. By telling them that John Thomas only read his Bible, it sets an example that they should only read theirs. If they never learn anything else, they'll be less likely to see another perspective or challenge the authority of the group or leave the group. I guess that's kind of where this podcast comes in, because once I saw these things not adding up in the historical narrative, I realized this could be really helpful and interesting for other ex-Christadelphians to hear. But don't worry, we're still not done our story yet. The Christadelphians haven't even been founded yet, so let's keep moving. John Thomas continued to be a Campbellite into the early 1840s. And it's hard to give a firm date on when he stopped being a Campbellite and started being Christadelphian. It was kind of like the Animorph books, where there's a gradual transition from a human into an animal, but instead it's John Thomas turning from a Campbellite into a Christadelphian. Some people could say that John Thomas became a Christadelphian when the Campbellites began to stop associating with him around 1837, 1838, when he began sharing views that Alexander Campbell didn't agree with. However, it wasn't until 1847 that he decided to get baptized for a third time, because he was sure he'd finally figured it all out this time, and his beliefs regarding baptism had changed, so he was going for round 3. However, Hemingway writes in his book that he believes the origin of the Christadelphians should be considered July of 1843, although some articles he published in 1847 are considered the beginning of the Christadelphians. And if you do a Google search, it says 1848, because that was the year he published his first book, Elpis Israel, and that means the hope of Israel in Greek. However, Hemingway also writes that Thomas didn't fully separate from the Campbellites and the other groups he was affiliated with, like the Millerites, until around 1859. This is complicated by the fact that the name Christadelphian wasn't in use until 1864. And we'll talk about the origin of the name in another episode as well. I guess it would just be best to say his anamorphs phase of becoming a Christadelphian was somewhere between 1837 and 1859, as he was really pushed out of the Campbellite organization and began forming his own religious sect as the other people began to leave with him. This is actually pretty wild when you stop to think about it, because you once again have to hold several opposing ideas as true at once to believe the Christadelphian origin story. Even if any of those dates Hemingway proposed was confirmed as the origin of the group, and again, those that he just said, 1843, 1847, John Thomas was still preaching as a Campbellite in the 1850s. Hemingway is saying John Thomas had Christadelphian beliefs in the 1840s, but also tells us there was no group called the Christadelphians until 1864, almost 20 years later. In his history, Hemingway also continues to share all about John Thomas's involvement in Campbellite and even Millerite churches during this time period. So forget any semblance of John Thomas being independent, like Hemingway mentioned, since Dr. Thomas still didn't leave the group when he wrote his book outlining what Christadelphians claim are their beliefs. It's actually ironic that the original book, outlining Christadelphian beliefs that they hold dear, was written by a Campbellite. The story of John Thomas always emphasizes that he was a Christadelphian, but John Thomas was in fellowship with Campbellites for over 25 years, and he was a Campbellite when he wrote his book, Elpis Israel. If Christadelphians found the truth, does that mean the Campbellites found it? Because at this point, they are so intertwined and nearly interchangeable that I don't really know how they can claim to be unrelated and how they can ignore his association with them in their origin story. All right, so let's review what we found about the Christadelphian origin myth so far. And not everything was wrong, so we'll review that real quick. We've confirmed that John Thomas was a doctor from England who nearly died in a shipwreck on his way to America, and that he did write some books on religion that are still read by Christadelphians today. So great, we got a few things that are right. However, just by looking at the history of the Christadelphians for ourselves, it appears that we have not been told the truth about the origin of the Christadelphians and who John Thomas was. And that's pretty scary, because if we were supposed to trust the Christadelphians with our one chance at eternal life, and they're wrong about these simple facts from 200 years ago, then why should we trust them with telling us the truth about anything else? And especially about things that were supposedly happened thousands of years ago. If you can't keep your story straight about 200 years ago, how can you keep it straight about 2,000 years ago? These examples weren't even that difficult to verify. We have thousands of pages of his magazine writings and letters and books and other types of evidence from his lifetime to verify this. And if you don't want to take my word for it, look at the books. Look at these references for yourself. I have them linked in the episode of the show, in the show notes. And what's even crazier is these aren't critical commentaries of the Christadelphians from outsiders. Most of the sources I used are their own sources that were written by Christadelphians. Now that we've looked at the historical evidence for the various claims of the Christadelphian origin story myth, we have to ask one last question. Did John Thomas rediscover Christadelphianism? Could you actually need me to answer that question? We went through this. Christadelphian teachings came from the Campbellites because they came from John Thomas, who was a prominent Campbellite teacher who later left the group to form his own sect. From reading through Christadelphian history books, it's clear that Appleton's Cyclopedia was correct. John Thomas left a religious group, the Campbellites, to form his own sect, the Christadelphians. That's the origin of the Christadelphians. What's kind of funny, though, is that Robert Roberts tried to offer an explanation for the origins of the Christadelphians, but he accidentally ended up showing his support for Campbellism instead. There's an incredibly disappointing quote in John Thomas's biography, which is supposed to help address this question of their origin. Roberts wrote, quote, "How is it, they say, that this has not been found out before? How is it that Dr. Thomas should find it out and nobody else?" The present work indirectly proposed an answer to this question, At all events, to the second part of it, it proposed to show how the truth has been found out, without dealing with the question of why so many have not found it, unquote. I can't get over this, since Robert acknowledges that these are important questions that should be answered about where it came from. This quote recognizes and indicates that people saw this group as something new, since they're asking why hasn't it been found before. He claims his biography of John Thomas will answer the questions, then backpedals it by saying it's indirectly answered, then downgrades it again at the end by saying he's choosing not to answer as to why it's never been found out. And if you read Robert's biography, it eventually devolves into Robert's just reprinting letters between Thomas and other Campbellites. So all he has for evidence is the history of John Thomas's involvement in the Campbellite religion. In fact, in chapter 5, he even writes, quote, "The doctor addressed the public on the ancient faith, which he considered the faith promulgated by Mr. Campbell to be," unquote. Did you hear that? The Campbellites have the ancient faith, not the Christadelphians. Unless, of course, you admitted that the Christadelphians came from the Campbellites and they're really not that different. I don't know. Unfortunately, John Thomas really did believe in the Campbellite teachings, and he basically kept preaching the same thing with the addition of some differing views on baptism. Then he began preaching to his followers, after he disassociated with the Campbellites. But yeah, even Robert Roberts wasn't able to provide a convincing argument for why anyone should consider John Thomas to have discovered an ancient faith. And he was a contemporary and the biggest supporter of Dr. Thomas. This quote also begins to highlight one of the double binds of the religion. John Thomas is supposedly so intelligent that he understood this theology solely from reading the Bible, while thousands of other religious leaders throughout history never even came close, besides the Campbellites, I suppose. He is just so much smarter and more competent than everyone else. I also think his writings indicate that he may have been going out of his way to try to sound intelligent and scientific in order to impress people. However, Christadelphian beliefs are also supposed to be so obvious and easy to believe based on reading the Bible. Christadelphians almost mock people who don't believe what they believe, because all you have to do is read your Bible. So which is it? Why has this set of beliefs not been found out before if it's so easy to decipher? Or is Dr. Thomas someone to be elevated to a higher status due to his unique ability to figure out the core messages of the Bible, which have been forgotten until the Christadelphians, figured it out and learned it? But he's not a prophet and he's not special. So why hasn't anyone else found out this knowledge in almost 2,000 years? If it's so obvious, why aren't there more Christadelphians? After all, shouldn't congregations just be popping up and joining the larger body of Christadelphians as they discover their beliefs from reading the Bible, instead of splitting off? Have you seen and know about the splits in the Christadelphians as they break from the main group and realize that their beliefs don't completely align? Interesting. Besides the fact that they boldly recorded their true origins, there is no record of Christadelphians before the 1800s because they never existed, so there was nothing to rediscover. John Thomas did not revive an ancient religion. You could say he discovered Campbellism the same way I discovered sushi, by finally deciding to try something that already existed. It was delicious, and I recommend it. But you can't take credit for being the first to discover something if it already exists. And you can't rediscover something that has never existed. Imagine that I, for the sake of this example, agree with all Christadelphian teachings, except for one point. We're going to say the origin of sin was in Eve, or something like that differs with the Christadelphians on just one point. Imagine that in this scenario, I had spent at least 3 decades, studying the Christadelphian teachings with them in their meeting. If I left and founded my own church and continued to do everything the same, except for how I spoke about my beliefs around the subject that I believe differently on, which I guess I'm also a man here because I'm allowed to preach in this scenario, then would you say I discovered a new religion? Of course not. At least credit your sources. He left over disagreement on teachings. If he had been allowed to continue preaching his beliefs and he hadn't pissed off Alexander Campbell, he probably wouldn't have even left. The present-day Christadelphians could still be calling themselves Campbellites. This history is a bummer, for sure. Unfortunately, there was no magical library in Narnia that he just stumbled into that held the answers. That would have been really cool. It wasn't from an independent reading of the Bible. It wasn't when he was alone. It wasn't only using the Bible. These are all the Christadelphian myths besides the Narnia thing. What's confusing is that, despite all the evidence that they record, Christadelphians in general remain in denial about this. The first line of Hemingway's book is that, quote, "This book is a series of glimpses into the origin of the truth in America," unquote. But is it? Is this the origin of the Christadelphians? Or is it the origin of the myth of the truth? Also, as a side note, did you notice that he doesn't even call it the Christadelphians? He calls it the truth. So you know he only expected Christadelphians to read it since they'll accept the lingo and won't be confused or alarmed. But what is truth when you don't provide and believe the evidence for it? They say that faith is essential in the absence of evidence. But faith in spite of the evidence is not faith. The truth of the Christadelphians is that their teachings are just a modified version of the Campbellite belief system. Again, that's fine in general. Maybe the Campbellites were really rad and smart or whatever. But I know I was a Christadelphian and I never once heard the word Campbellite. So it definitely concerns me that I never heard about this when I was a member. I just heard this myth about this guy reading his Bible after he nearly died on a boat. It sure looks like the Christadelphians created a myth about their origin and didn't do a good job hiding the real history from everybody. Why are you writing books showing the evidence you don't want everyone to know? That's just not a great long-term plan. The only reason I can think of that they would want to deny that their group was founded by John Thomas is because they don't want to admit that the group exists because of a charismatic leader. That does not have the best implications for a small religious group looking for, validation of their identity. So instead, they use this phrasing that demotes his influence within the group, so it sounds more accidental than essential. Unfortunately, this requires dulling your critical thinking and ignoring the facts of the situation. If you haven't already started to ask critical questions, here's a few. Why does every history of the group start with John Thomas? Even Robert Roberts wrote in his autobiography, My Days and My Ways, that, quote, "It was not long before we made many inquiries concerning the doctor's past life. It's natural to be interested in a man's history when you are interested in his work, especially when, as in this case, the history of the man was the history of the work, and the most important work under the sun, the history of the recovery of the knowledge of God's own truth in this dark and evil, priest-ridden and atheism-desolated age," unquote. This could be reworded slightly, besides the priest-hating, slightly just to say, the history of the man John Thomas was the history of the Christadelphians. Of course, the Christadelphians wouldn't exist if John Thomas hadn't hated the priest-ridden Society of England. What's interesting is that only John Thomas and Robert Roberts' biographies are pushed as significant essential reading for the Christadelphians. Why are there so many books about John Thomas if he played such a small role? Wouldn't their history books start with the 1st century and show how the Christadelphians have always existed, if that was the case, rather than Campbellism? I would love to see exactly how John Thomas rediscovered the truth. Where did he start? How did he prove that the group existed in the 1st century? If John Thomas rediscovered something that existed, Robert Roberts would have included the documentation showing this group had existed. He was a contemporary to John Thomas, so he would have been exposed to the same ideas. It's apparent that there isn't a clear path from Jesus to modern-day Christadelphians. It seems that writing John Thomas out of the picture would have been too challenging, so instead of denying the role of him as founder completely, they just reframed it where he played a significant role, but he's not given the credit of founding the group, which, ouch, he gave some blood and sweat to create this religion. Rude. So that brings us to the end of our episode on John Thomas and the origin of the Christadelphians. I hope you enjoyed learning about the history of this group with me and continue to ask questions and examine the evidence for their claims. If, like me, you were once a member of the Christadelphians, I hope this episode has been helpful in sharing some Christadelphian history, encouraging you to ask questions, and recharge your critical thinking skills. After all, if it's the truth, shouldn't it hold up to a little scrutiny? Before you go, I'd like to read another quote by Robert Roberts from Dr. Thomas, His Life and Work. In the opening chapter, he writes, quote, "The following narrative is of equal authenticity with an autobiography. It is founded on information imparted orally to the writer by the doctor himself," unquote. This sentence has really stuck with me. How can a book written as an autobiography be credible if it's not written by the person themselves? I'm sure it's authentic and he's relating the stories he was told by the doctor. But the word choice of autobiography, I couldn't even write an acceptable biography for my parents, my spouse, my best friend, because I wasn't there for their childhoods, private experiences they had, and I only know what they chose to talk with me about when we were together. Considering your writing is almost equal to an autobiography, that really makes me question what kind of relationship they had, that this author, Robert Roberts, was almost merging his identity with Dr. Thomas, a man 34 years his senior, who was living in America by the time Roberts was born, in Scotland. In fact, they only knew each other in person for 9 years since they met in 1862 and the doctor died in 1871. They had only been in touch a few years prior when Robert Roberts wrote him a letter, and I don't think being pen pals really makes you qualified to write a biography, or especially an autobiography. So in our next history episode, we're going to talk about who is this man who had such an intense and intimate relationship with Dr. Thomas, and why did he write this biography of his life? So in the next episode, I'll introduce you to the other pioneer of the Christadelphians, Mr. Robert Roberts, and I am very excited about that episode, so I hope you tune in to learn more about Christadelphian history. If you're someone who has left the Christadelphians and is looking for community or want to be a part of the conversation about our lives after leaving the group, I highly recommend joining us on Facebook at a group for ex-Christadelphians, or if you're interested in joining me on the podcast to be interviewed or come on as a guest, you can reach out to me at lifeafterleavingpodcast@gmail.com. Please feel free to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Life After Leaving Podcast, or leave us a rating and review. Your engagement helps spread the word about this show. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.